Hi, good evening. Very excited to be here this evening. Just waiting for a couple of people to come on. We're doing a really exciting interview. I've been looking forward to this. Joanna's just joining. We're going to be interviewing the creator of a project called If You Heard What I Heard, which is a project interviewing the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. I'll tell you a little bit about her.
Hi.
Hi, Joe. How you doing?
Yeah, good. How are you?
I'm good. We're just waiting for Carolyn. Oh, hi. Okay, I can see she's joined the room. I'll just start telling you a little bit about Carolyn while we're waiting for her. Let's see. Accept.
There we go.
Hi. How are you doing?
Good. How are you? It's so nice to see you both.
You too. You too.
Thank you.
I'm just going to do a little intro about you, and then we'll start the interview, if that's okay. So Carolyn Siegel is the grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors and the founder of If You Heard What I Heard, an independent docu-series based project which captures the stories of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, the last generation to ever hear survivor stories firsthand. Carolyn is a Los Angeles native and marketing executive. She started If You Heard What I Heard to keep the stories of her grandparents' survival and stories like hers alive and relevant for today. If You Heard What I Heard launched last April with 15 interviews of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and another 10 interviews launching on January the 26th, 2022. The interviews focus on what these Holocaust survivor grandparents went through, how they survived and rebuilt their lives, and the important lessons their grandchildren apply to their lives today, and how they are preserving their grandparents' legacies. It's such a beautiful project. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where the idea for this project came from, how it started?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, let me just say thank you so much for inviting me to join you on this Instalive and for all of the support you both have given this project. It's literally been such a pleasure to get to know Joanna and Braca over the past, few months and talking about doing this, and just all of your encouragement and support and belief in this project really makes such a difference. So thank you. I just wanted to relay that. Yeah, it's such an honor to be here with you today and with your followers as well. So to answer your question, If You Heard What I Heard really started from this desire to, want to preserve memory for the future. I live in Los Angeles, and maybe over a year ago, there was a series of protests that were happening. This was in May of 2020. And these sort of protests that were happening throughout our city really had nothing to do with the Jewish people, but there was a synagogue that was graffitied. And I remember feeling like, this is like the 5th or 6th anti-Semitic incident this year alone in Los Angeles. Well, it turns out that was just one of over 2,000 incidents in 2020 to occur nationwide in the US. So I really felt like we're seeing this rise of anti-Semitism, and that was well before even, the recent rise and surge of anti-Semitism that we've seen globally. Although these anti-Semitic attacks have been happening, it just seems like they're happening at a much more frequent pace. And I really thought about, well, are we losing touch with the stories of the Holocaust? Because when I was growing up, there seemed to be such a care and empathy for those who had survived the Holocaust, but in general, there just seemed to be much more compassion and not as many, of these anti-Semitic incidents and violent attacks. So I wanted to do something to change that. And I thought about the resources that exist today. And I thought about, the amazing work that the Steven Spielberg USC Shoah Foundation has done to preserve memory and capturing testimony from survivors, which is so crucial. And thank God that testimony exists for all time. But there was something missing for today. And I thought about, well, who's going to sit down and watch a 2+ hour interview that was filmed 25 years ago, of somebody who was probably in their 80s at the time, with a very, thick accent that might be harder to really relate to for today. Again, not wanting to take away from the important stories and hearing directly from a survivor. That comes first always. But how do we make it relatable for today? And I thought, well, I'm theoretically not that young and I'm not that cool, but I'm still sort of young and cool. So if you heard the story from somebody like me and you could hear it in under 30 minutes and you could see maybe a clip of that on social media, maybe we could drive more awareness and empathy out there. And this project really isn't, the stories are not meant to be these hard-hitting interviews or, anyone sort of coming aggressively at Holocaust education, you have to learn these stories and you have to hear these stories. It's really meant to be sitting down with someone, feeling like you're having a coffee with a friend, just hearing their story. And I think that's what really makes the project unique.
Wow, it's truly amazing initiative. How did you find the interviewees?
It's a great question. So having grown up in Los Angeles had a very large survivor community after the Holocaust. Whether there were relatives that lived here or friends or, whatever the case may be. But I grew up with a lot of, fellow Jews who were also grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. But it had been maybe, 20 years since I had grown up with these people that, that I knew were other grandchildren of survivors. So, I really turned to social media and I put up a Facebook post and I said, do I know anyone who's the grandchild of Holocaust survivors? And within 24 hours, I had 12 people respond right away and say, I'm the grandchild of a survivor. And that's sort of how it started. And it's been very, word of mouth and referral from there. But the first 15 interviews, I would say maybe 80% were, are friends of mine that I knew before filming that he had either responded to my Facebook post or that I reached out to and said, will you participate? And this next round that's launching next week was a few of them are personal friends of mine, but then also, referrals and, oh, you've got to film my cousin or, oh, you have to film my friend because their story is really incredible. And, or just people that I've connected with through even, Instagram just by doing this work, and putting this out there. So.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Is it a US based or international project?
So at the moment it's US based from the perspective of we've only filmed, grandchildren who are based in the US, but I would certainly say it could be international. I'm certainly open to filming anyone out there, wherever they live, who has a story to share.
Incredible.
So, yeah. So what have been some of the most powerful takeaways for you when filming these testimonies? Must have been, did you film them or they film themselves? How did it work? And also hearing their stories.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously during COVID, it's a difficult time to film anything in person. And I don't actually come from a film background. I'm a marketing executive. So this has all been new territory for me at, really at every turn. But, thank God for the use of technology. I've been able to film on iPhone. So the interviewee films themselves on iPhone with me off to the side on a Google Meet or a Zoom asking questions. So I'm there sort of guiding the filming process, but the interviewee is filming and then they send it to me and I edit it in special editing software. And that's how we've been able to make it work. Yeah. But so to answer your question, as far as how the filming process has impacted me, you know, I just really set out on this journey to preserve memory and capture these stories and make sure that we weren't losing touch with the stories of the Holocaust. My grandfather said to me when I was quite young, I must have been about 8 years old, when he told me the story of his family and how he survived. And at the same time, he said to me, it's the job of your generation to make sure the world doesn't forget. And that's really how this project started, and where it was born from was making sure the world doesn't forget. I really have been surprised and wasn't expecting to focus or capture the stories of resilience. I mean, I know that sounds almost like, how could you not capture the stories of resilience? Of course, these are survivors. And there are moments during filming where it's very difficult. I mean, I'm hearing stories of, you know, children who are experimented on by Dr. Mengele in Auschwitz, and like families being ripped apart, babies being ripped from mothers' arms. It's gut-wrenching when you hear this. And hearing it over and over is very, very challenging. But it's been my saving grace in filming to keep reminding myself that these are people who survived and they made it through and they rebuilt their lives. So I think, you know, I always had a sense of, no matter what I'm dealing with in my life, I can get through it. And you'll hear a lot of interviewees say that in their interviews as well. Like, what I deal with in my life is nothing compared to what my grandparents went through. But I would say that that's certainly been true for me in the filming process. And it certainly has impacted the way I view my own life, with much more like, I can handle any challenge, and the reminder of resilience and to keep pushing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. These stories are amazing. And I just had a call today with somebody, and another interviewee, and we were just saying, like, it's, how did they survive? How? Because these circumstances were just like so crazy. But then, you know, a friend of mine who I interviewed for this project, her interview is launching next week, and she was saying, but you know what, it's in our DNA. It's in our DNA to survive. And actually, the youngest person that I filmed for this project, she was 16 when we filmed her, Vivian, and she says that. She said, it's in my blood to survive. And I think there's something really powerful about that.
That's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. So how do you think the idea of intergenerational trauma plays out for our generation after hearing these stories, growing up hearing these stories of some of our grandparents went through?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, there's no question that there's inherited trauma. Actually, somebody who I filmed for this project is a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Melissa Wasserman, and she is a clinical psychologist and specializes in intergenerational trauma. She actually did her dissertation for her doctorate on intergenerational trauma of Holocaust survivors. But for our generation, 3Gs in particular, I think that trauma is really manifested in, I think it's morphed in some ways. I think that, you know, I look at my mom and the trauma that she has, which is much more behavioral, based on like, I have to make sure that there's enough food, you know, because her parents went through periods of, you know, being hungry or not having enough. There's this sort of like idea of not having enough, and I have to have enough. And her trauma is much more rooted in the stuff. I have to have enough stuff and I have to feel safe. Mine is I think has morphed into, what are the warning signs? You know, what are the antenna that go up for me that might create an unsafe situation, and how can I get ahead of it? Or also, I think where it's manifested for a lot of the interviewees is, again, this idea of resilience. I think the inherited trauma really has morphed into resilience for a lot of us, in the sense of, you know, I can be strong and I can get through it and I can pick myself up. I mean, I don't know if that is, you know, falls under the definition of trauma, but I certainly think that it's a DNA morphology of the trauma, is to sort of have this like inner strength of, I'm going to figure it out and I'm going to get through it.
It's also about never happening again. Like, you find a lot of Jews, like, they take they take on this kind of moral kind of, you know, all different backgrounds, and they, you know, God forbid that this ever kind of happens to anyone. And you'll find that, you know, we fight. I think we do fight for all different reasons. I think as well there's a sensitivity. Like some people are so, I'm overly sensitive about the Holocaust. Like even reading a book makes me, you know, I couldn't sleep. Like if I the last time I watched a Holocaust film was, I can tell you exactly, was 5 years ago. I'm still traumatized from it. I like the, you know, the mere thought. I think some people can't maybe always deal with it because, but it's. Yeah. But what do you think makes this project so unique? Because it's so incredible.
Oh, thank you. I really do. I think it is the resilience. And I do just want to touch on what you said, Joanna, about, you know, and going back to the trauma piece. I think there is a trigger there for a lot of us of not wanting to see it happen again. I think that is, I'm so happy you mentioned that, because I definitely hear that in the interviews. The interviewees, a lot of them say, you know, I stand up and I speak up and I do whatever I can to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so I think that's a very important piece to keep in mind. But I really think the piece that makes this project unique, there are a few things. I think one, you know, this is the first project ever of this nature to focus on grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. It's never been done before in this way. There have certainly been other projects that have focused on, you know, third generation Holocaust survivors, but nothing like this. So I'm very, very proud of that, certainly. But, you know, also we focus on the resilience. I think a lot of times with Holocaust movies or books or projects, there's so much focus on, oh my gosh, they survived what? You know, or they can't believe they went through that. And I think what's so unique is that we really paint a picture of what these people's lives were like before their lives were upended and how they rebuilt after. And not only that, but the second part of the interview really focuses on what is the takeaway for today. You know, as a grandchild of a survivor who might be raising children who are going to be 4Gs or 5Gs, you know, what does that look like? And what do they want their kids to remember about these stories? And the answer is almost always, I want my kids to remember that if, you know, that they can get through anything, that they should be proud of their Judaism. They should be proud of where they come from, and they should not let anybody, you know, stand in the way of their practicing their Judaism or being proud to be Jewish.
Amazing. I mean, you've kind of just answered our next question of why do you think this project is so important for future generations? It's exactly those lessons, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, if Dana Arshan, who is an interviewee coming out in this next round, she's actually a journalist, and she does a lot of journalism around Holocaust survivors, and her grandfather, thank God, is still alive. And, you know, she says in her interview, and it's in our trailer that you've shared today as well, you know, she says, if I don't share his story, who will? And it's so true, because unfortunately the survivor generation is dying out. And sure, you know, our parents could share these stories, but I mean, my parents are in their 70s. So, you know, it's up to us. It's up to our generation. And Amy, who's another interviewee from this next round, Amy actually talks about, you know, it's our generation's time. It's time for us to step up and do our part. And I think she's absolutely right in saying that. And I was so happy she said that in her interview. It couldn't be more true. I think for future generations, Rafa, to answer your question, you know, it is taking away the resilience and what these survivors went through, and exactly what you've said, you know, Joanna, about making sure it doesn't happen again. I think that's one of the biggest things that, you know, hear my story, hear what my grandparent went through, look at their photographs, understand where they came from, and that this was someone with a family and a life and friends just like you and me. So if it happened to her, and not even 100 years ago, it could happen in the future. And how do we keep that from happening again?
Well, so what has been the impact on the people who have participated? Any stories about how it has affected them?
Yeah, I think that's been another, you know, personally for me, that's been one of the most rewarding parts of this project is seeing how it's impacted the other interviewees. And I think for a lot of them, it's given them an opportunity to piece the story together chronologically in a way that they wouldn't normally have done. So, I think for a lot of us, we get the stories in bits and pieces here and there throughout our lives. But when you actually sit down and map it out chronologically, there's something very powerful about that. And I think for a lot of interviewees, they recognize the magnitude of what their ancestor went through in a very different way. So I think that's really impacted them. And I've had a lot of interviewees say to me, I never thought about how I'm going to talk about this, this event with my children. But now after doing this project, it's given me a sense of what I want to share with them and how I want to frame it. And I think, again, the biggest impact, I keep coming back to this idea of resilience, but I think that a lot of our interviewees really have been impacted by the resilience. And they share that it impacts them in their everyday life. But I think going through this process of filming and getting it out, I think it reinforces that for them.
There's also a part that we kind of feel as our children. Like, I'm just thinking about me, like, because I am so sensitive and, part of my extended family, but it's just like, do we want to tell them this horrible, like, how could humanity, like, I feel some part of me, maybe, I don't know about you, Bracha, but I haven't really gone into details with my kids, and maybe this is a way kind of to show the children, to kind of give the future generations, every generation we need something different kind of thing. And as it is terribly sad that we need to keep it going. We need to keep remembering, and this resilience you're talking about, it's very true.
Yeah, it's important. It's a tricky thing, I think, to know when and how to talk to your children about it. And my hope is that, exactly as you said, Joanna, that this project can be a gateway in. It's a little bit of a lighter touch. There are some stories that are, all of the stories are very traumatic, certainly, but there are some that, that don't really have grandparents who went through the concentration camps. And so those tend to be a little bit, a more digestible way in, I think, for a younger audience. I have a disclaimer on the site that says, not recommended for children under 13. But I would certainly say that, as a parent, there are a few interviews on the site that certainly would be appropriate for a bit younger than that. I can think of Cameron's interview as an example. Cameron is actually, it's interesting. She's an interesting story. She's Catholic, and her grandmother was a Viennese Jew. And as a child, the parents put her and her brother in Catholic school for about 4 years so that they could, try and figure out a way to save their family. And the nuns that took in these children, really protected them, during the 30s, when the late 30s, when, these Viennese Jews were being rounded up and facing all these anti-Semitic attacks. And, Cameron talks about the fact that her parents, they were international art dealers, and they were able to secure visas to get out. And actually, there's an interesting, I know that, Bracha, you're based in London, like there's an interesting connection there with Cameron's story in particular, because her parents at that point, I think the way the visas worked, her father, the grandmother's father and brother were able to go to London, and Cameron's grandmother and the great grandmother were able to come via Cuba to the United States. But because they were international art dealers, the Cameron's great grandfather was actually able to set up a gallery in London called the Hazlitt Gallery that remained in the family for many, many years. So yeah, so that's an example of a story that still gives an idea and talks about the Holocaust and talks about anti-Semitism and the survival, but would probably be more digestible for a younger child.
Yeah, that's an amazing story, and it just shows how resourceful people are as well in finding a way to make it all work. Yeah, I'm going to listen to that one. So can you tell us what are some of the channels through which you are promoting the project, and how can people find out more and watch the videos?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a website. It's ifyouheardwhatiheard.com. And that's the best place to go to watch the interviews. And this next round, so we have 15 interviews on the site currently, another 10 are launching on the 26th, as you've mentioned. And we've really been using social media, mainly Instagram and Facebook. We're not on Twitter, but we've mainly been using social media to sort of get the word out. And the interviewees have been incredibly supportive. They've all been, posting and talking about it and sharing with their friends and family. And that's been a really nice way to sort of like build the community. And of course, working with wonderful people like you that are so supportive. I mean, that's been another really great way for us to promote the project. But we've been doing a lot of, panel discussions and events and partnerships with various museums, and that's really been wonderful as well.
So we touched on this, but how are you planning on continuing the project for future generations?
Yeah. I think I'm so focused on 3G, the grandchildren of survivors, but I certainly think that there's room to film 4G and 5G. I've actually had a few, I don't think we're at 5G yet. I think that demographic is probably, if they're born yet, they're very little. But I certainly had a few 3Gs approach me and say, are you doing anything for 4Gs? I had one gentleman that I was in communication with, and he said, my daughter is in college and she's a 4G, but she knew my grandmother and heard her story. And so I think there's certainly room to include 4Gs. I think we're not quite there yet. The project is still, very much in its infancy.
That's a very Jewish idea, isn't it, as well? How stories get passed down from generation to generation, and it's really important.
Yeah, I love that you said that, actually, because one of the interviewees, Aaron Aftergood, who I filmed for this, he says it in his interview, that there's this idea of like the same way we do with Passover, like the Passover story gets shared. It's like kind of a similar idea with our Holocaust story, that we need to share that generation after generation so it doesn't get lost. And it's really interesting when you think about that idea, because the Holocaust, as I've mentioned, was not even 100 years ago. So it still feels somewhat recent. But when you think about that in the context of Passover, which was like thousands of years ago, can we relate to the story of Passover, and how do we relate to it for today? And so thinking about that in contrast with the Holocaust, it's an interesting parallel. So
very interesting.
Yeah.
So
can you share with us some of the ways that you have heard people finish the sentence, if you heard what I heard, ...
Yeah, I think the biggest one is, if you heard what I heard, you would never forget. And that's certainly one that as a project we say a lot. You'll sort of see that on the end of our trailer, and all of the interviews say it in their interviews. If you heard what I heard, you would never forget. And this concept of never forgetting is so crucial, and something that is so important. A lot of us say how important that was to our grandparents. So that is like a, sort of mainstay of the project, but it certainly has taken other avenues as well, especially with the recent rise of anti-Semitism. If you heard what I heard, you would do everything in your power to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's a very big one that we hear a lot. Another one, actually, Dr. Melissa Wasserman, who I had mentioned before, is a clinical psychologist and participated in this project. Melissa actually shares in her interview, it's not just if you heard what I heard, but if you felt what I felt. Because I think a lot of us really felt the pain that our grandparents went through when they would talk about this, and witness just like the loss. And I even talk about this in my interview, just to some level, even disbelief. I actually watched part of a Shoah interview testimony of one of the other interviewees I'm going to be filming for the third round of filming coming up. And the grandmother was talking about, the Nazis murdered my family. And the way she said it was just, and I said to my friend who was sharing this video with me, I said, my gosh, it's amazing. I thought it was just my grandfather, but hearing her, it's like, when they say it, they murdered my family, it's almost like there's still something in their voice that is disbelief, even at that point. For this grandmother, I think she must have been in her 80s when she filmed this interview, to still have disbelief after what, might have been 50 years after the fact at that point. I think that's really, so when Melissa talks about if you felt what I felt, I think there's a bit of that too. There's still this disbelief. And I think as grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, a lot of interviewees I talk to say, I still can't really wrap my head around the fact that we have so many branches of the family tree that are just gone. And I think that hits a lot of us, very powerfully as well.
Is there a piece about, I think I saw this on one of your trailers as well, how it gives people purpose as well. If you had what
Absolutely.
I had, you would live with that, with purpose.
Yeah, I'm so happy you mentioned that, Rafa. Thank you. Yeah, it's such an important piece. So Label Mangel, who we've filmed for this next round, and his interview is again launching next week. He's actually the executive director of the Lone Soldier program for an organization called Magen Am. If anybody's familiar with it, Magen Am works with former IDF soldiers to protect the Jewish community, which is incredible. And especially for somebody like him being the grandchild of a survivor, to be involved with this organization. Label, actually, his story is really amazing, but he had actually joined, he's an American citizen and chose to join the Israeli Defense Force. And I think part of that decision came from, his lineage and what his grandfather had been through in the Holocaust, to want to, be part of an army. And he talks about this, to be part of an army that will always protect the Jewish people. But he talks about living with purpose, that this idea of never again for him is a lifestyle, to really make it true and to live with purpose, to live with, live a lifestyle of never again is something that he really talks about. And making sure that, he's one that really talks about like standing up for the Jewish people and speaking up and doing the right thing, even if it's not the popular thing to do, that standing up for what's right and making the right decisions, to live with that sort of mindset is really important to him. And Emily Kane Miller, who I've also, filmed for this project. And she's also in part of that trailer where she talks about living with purpose. And it's really beautiful, actually. She talks about, there's this idea that I have to be like 10 times bigger than what I would normally be because I'm standing in the shoes of people who aren't here. And there's something so incredible about that, to live. She talks about like living her life every day with this sense of like being the best that she can be, or being more than she thought she could, or that this idea that she can accomplish anything. That's a really incredible feeling to know that, because the fact that you are here, and she talks about this, she says, the fact that I am here is a miracle. So to know that, it really does empower you to feel like there's nothing that stands in your way. You can get through it. You can do anything. And I hear that over and over again in the interviews, that I can do anything. And that's pretty incredible. What a gift,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
So the new round of videos, the interviews will be coming out on the 26th of January. Is that right?
Yes, next Wednesday. So it's a day before International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And that's sort of, I don't know if that'll continue, with the timing, but when we launched the project in April, we launched a day before Yom HaShoah. Actually, we were supposed to launch on Yom HaShoah, and one of the interviewees of this project, Rabbi Jeremy Ruberg, who's a rabbi in New Jersey, I was set to launch on, as I mentioned, on Yom HaShoah. And after speaking with him, I changed it to the day before, because he talked about, Yom HaShoah is a day for him that he takes really seriously, almost as seriously as like Yom Kippur, that it's a day of just like reflection and, really thinking about what these survivors and what these families went through, what our people went through, and taking it seriously. And after he said that, I said, I can't launch on Yom HaShoah, because that's really powerful. This is a day to really reflect and pray and, and think about what happened and remember. So I need to honor that, and I'm going to launch a day before. And so I've sort of kept with that, because I never want to take away from the solemnness and the power of the actual day, whether it be International Holocaust Remembrance Day or Yom HaShoah.
Wow.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and it will give people the right mind frame if they manage to watch some of the interviews before Holocaust Memorial Day to really go into it with that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, and another sort of like interesting layer that is not often talked about, but something to keep in mind, you know, as we're looking at, you know, the website or even some of the marketing materials, and I wouldn't say this happens all the time, but with me being a marketer, I think about things like this. I try wherever possible, you'll notice that the colors are black, yellow, and white. And the yellow really comes from like there's two sides to that with the yellow. One is, I think where a lot of us are familiar with the Nazis made Jews wear a yellow star to identify that they were Jewish. But there's also this idea of, you know, the land of Israel sort of like having this like the gold and Zahav, like the land of Israel is sort of having gold to it and the beauty and rebirth. So that's why that color was chosen, to sort of honor the past and look to the future. And if you look at some of the marketing on the website, and as I've said in the, you know, in the sort of social media posts, wherever possible, we try to have the yellow be the color for the words that focuses on what was, and the white be like the light of the future. So
wow, yeah, that's amazing.
Oh.
I was just thinking about this, ladies, about this, is that the world is also teaching about this like baseless hatred, like, you know, all these kind of things that, you know, we hate people for no reason, and like sadly it's kind of rising in different areas and different places, and it's painful because we know that what it can cause, this baseless hatred, it could cause such awful things, that it's something that, you know, that we have to keep strong every generation. We have to keep the message going. And that's what's amazing about the Holocaust survivor and the generation. Like, you know, they have such kindness. Like if you hear some of their stories and like the books they've written, it's, you know, it's incredible what they've taken out of this. I mean, you know, it's overwhelming. It's just like, it's such an important project. It really is.
Thank you so much for saying that. And honestly, I mean, that's another thing that I hear a lot is that, you know, Dina, who is an educator, she's a teacher here in Los Angeles, and she and her husband actually wrote, we have an educator's resource page on our website, and she and her husband are both high school teachers, and so they wrote all of the, you know, curriculum and exercises and, you know, everything for that. And Dina actually talks about that in her interview, how, you know, my grandmother taught me not to hate, that we can be angry about what happened, we can be sad about the loss, but to never have hate. And you're right, Joanna. I mean, that's really amazing to think about what these survivors went through, and the fact that a lot of them came out and didn't have hate and just wanted to move on with their lives and start afresh. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, that's the best attitude. Yeah, I hear that. Okay, so we are really excited to announce that we have some exclusive clips from the upcoming videos, which we are going to be kind of releasing over the next week up until the 26th, in collaboration with If You Heard What I Heard. And so you can check those out on our social media page, Instagram, Facebook, and we'll be sharing those with you, so you can get a little taster of some of the interviews, which will be, the full interviews will be ready to watch on the 26th.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really, really lovely to meet with you. And everyone can follow you on, what's your Instagram tag?
Yes, it's If You Heard What I Heard. So at If You Heard What I Heard.
Okay, and I'll link it here in the description as well if people want to check out the project.
This was wonderful. Thank you both for all of your support and everything that you do with your podcast and your website to really, you know, just celebrate life. I mean, I'm so inspired by what you both do, and it's an honor to be here with both of you. So
thank you.
Thank you.
The honor's ours.
Yes.
well,
Thank
thank you
you.
for all
Be
your
well.
support. Yes, you too. Take care. Bye,
We'll be
everyone.
back
Thanks
soon.
for joining.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.